This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In the quiet suburban streets of California, nestled between rows of pristine white houses with manicured lawns, the Miller family lived a life that appeared perfect to anyone passing by. Their house stood tall, a modernist design that spoke of success and good taste, its gleaming windows reflecting the golden Californian sunsets. But behind the walls of this seemingly idyllic home, something far darker was brewing. Ember Miller, the youngest member of the family, was the quiet storm that would soon tear everything apart. Ember was 9 years old. On the outside, she was everything a child should be, small, with a round face framed by soft, dark hair that fell to her shoulders in a messy bob. Her skin was fair, almost porcelain-like, but often smudged with dirt from the little adventures she took around the house, exploring corners and closets that no one else ever thought to look at. Her eyes were the most striking feature, large and dark, set deep within her face like two pools of ink, absorbing everything around her without ever giving anything back. Her stare was unnerving, as if she saw things no one else could, things that existed only in the shadows. She had a way of watching people, of studying them with an intensity that made most adults uncomfortable. Her gaze was always calculating, always a few steps ahead of everyone else. But it wasn't just her eyes that made her seem out of place. It was the coldness in them, the emptiness. She was a child who had already learned how to mask her emotions, how to suppress her true thoughts and desires beneath a veneer of innocence. In school, they called her quiet, but they never suspected what she was truly capable of. Her parents, Carrie and Jason, were professionals. Carrie worked long hours as a real estate agent, her face always perfectly made up, always smiling, always polite. Jason, on the other hand, was an overworked tech executive, his work-life balance so skewed that he was often absent, buried under deadlines and work emails. They were not unkind, but neither were they attentive. They existed side by side in a house that was too big for just the four of them, a house filled with too many empty spaces, both physical and emotional. Their marriage, once vibrant, had slowly decayed into a quiet partnership, sustained more by routine than love. They exchanged polite greetings in the morning, brief words over dinner, and even fewer in the evenings before retreating to their separate spaces. They were too tired, too preoccupied with their own lives, to truly see what was happening under their roof. Eli, Ember's 12-year-old brother, was the only person who might have noticed the strange things happening in the house. He was a quiet child, introverted and sensitive, spending most of his time alone in his room, headphones in, the world outside muffled. He was the kind of boy who was easily ignored, not because he wasn't loved, but because he was too wrapped up in his own world to demand attention. He and Ember had a bond, of sorts. There were rare moments, when they'd sit together, a quiet understanding passing between them. Eli was aware that Ember was different, but like most children, he didn't know how to articulate it. He felt a mix of pity and confusion when he saw her staring off into space for hours, her eyes distant and hollow, as if she wasn't really there at all. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of her dark sketches hidden beneath her bed-twisted drawings of people with their eyes blacked out, or scenes where the family was depicted in strange, uncomfortable positions. But he never thought much of it. He assumed it was just a phase, the way kids sometimes go through odd stages. He didn't know, and couldn't know, that what Ember was drawing were not just fantasies, but blueprints. In her young mind, they were things to be done, not simply imagined. Ember's world was small, contained within the walls of that house, but it was also large, stretching into places that only she could see. Her bedroom was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the disconnect she felt from everyone else. It was sparsely furnished: a bed, a desk, a few shelves lined with books, some of which she'd read over and over again, others she simply leafed through, their contents unimportant to her. On the walls hung her drawings, framed pictures that seemed like random sketches at first glance, but the longer you looked at them, the more you saw. There were portraits of her family, her mother, her father, her brother, but none of them were normal. Her mother's smile was too wide, her eyes too hollow. Her father's face was always cast in shadow, the edges of his features blurred, as if something was pulling him into darkness. Eli was depicted as a silent figure, always alone, standing at the edge of a cliff, looking into a void, and in the corner of each drawing, there was always one thing, a dark, looming shape. A figure without face, without form, just a presence. At school, Ember was a ghost. She moved through the hallways without being noticed. A girl who sat at the back of the class, whose name was rarely called out. Her teachers thought her quiet, reserved. Some saw it as intelligence, others as an unsettling trait. But no one ever took the time to get to know her, to wonder what might be brewing behind those dark eyes. She never cried in class. She never raised her hand. She didn't speak, unless absolutely necessary. She was content to remain invisible, to let others occupy the space around her while she observed. The few friends she had, if they could even be called that, never lasted long. Ember didn't know how to connect with them, and she didn't want to. She found their chatter annoying, their games trivial. She had no interest in playing pretend, no desire to follow the rules of the playground. She preferred to be alone, wandering the edges of the school grounds, staring off into the trees, as if there were something calling to her from the distance. At home, things were no better. Her mother would scold her for being too quiet, too withdrawn. Carrie, absorbed in her own life, didn't understand the emptiness that seemed to consume her daughter. Jason, when he was home, would try to engage her, but the effort was always half-hearted. He had too many other things on his mind. The family dinners were full of awkward silences, where the only sounds were the clinking of silverware against plates. They rarely spoke of anything meaningful, and when they did, it was always about the superficial things, the weather, the house, the work that needed to be done. There was no conversation about feelings, no inquiry into Ember's life or her thoughts. They didn't ask, because they didn't want to know. Carrie thought Ember's oddness was simply a phase. She had seen other children go through it, withdrawn, introspective, secretive. It was normal, she believed, to want to keep to oneself. But there were days when Carrie noticed something unsettling in her daughter's eyes. It was the way Ember would watch her as if calculating something, the way she would tilt her head slightly, as though listening for a sound no one else could hear. And then there were the nights when Ember would stand by the window, staring out into the dark, her small silhouette framed against the dim glow of streetlights, unmoving for hours. Carrie tried to ignore it. She tried to pretend that everything was fine, that Ember was just going through a phase, a stage that all children went through. But deep down, Carrie felt a cold knot of unease every time she looked at her daughter. It was as if Ember was a puzzle alone that didn't quite fit with the rest of the family. And the more Carrie tried to dismiss it, the more she pushed the feeling away, the more the darkness inside Ember grew. Unseen, unheard, and uncared for, Ember's mind began to twist in ways that no child's mind should. She began to plan. She began to wait. The Miller family, for all its outward appearances, was a house built on fractures, and in Ember's mind, those fractures could no longer be ignored. The lines between what was real and what was fantasy began to blur. And soon, the family she had known would no longer exist. The quiet storm she had always been would break. But first, Ember had to make sure that everything was perfect. The house, the people, the way they would move, everything had to be in its place. Every detail had to be carefully crafted. And as Ember stood there, staring out the window into the night, she knew that soon, nothing would be the same again. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when the weight of something terrible finally settled into the Miller household. The kind of evening where everything appeared normal on the surface, the fading sun casting long shadows over the backyard, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the scent of freshly prepared dinner filling the air. Yet beneath the routine, a slow burn of unease flickered, unseen by the two adults and one child who sat around the dinner table, each lost in their own world, disconnected and unaware of the silent storm that was about to erupt. Jason sat at the head of the table, his face illuminated by the dim light overhead. He had just returned home from another grueling day at the tech company where he worked. His mind still clouded with unfinished tasks, emails to respond to, and deadlines to meet. His eyes were tired, sunken into his face, and his shoulders were tense, weighed down by the invisible burden of work. He didn't look up much during dinner, his focus mostly on his plate as he mechanically cut through his food, chewing with little thought. Carrie sat across from him, her fingers lightly tapping the rim of her wineglass as she talked about the day's business. Her words flowed easily, practiced, but her eyes betrayed the tension beneath her carefully constructed smile. She had spent the afternoon with clients, shown off million-dollar properties, and closed another deal, yet something gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slipping away from her, her marriage hollow and her daughter more distant by the day. But tonight, she was determined to push those thoughts aside. She would focus on the good, the mundane, the easy things. It was safer that way. Eli, their 12-year-old son, sat silently between them, his eyes focused on his plate, a frown pulling at his lips. He didn't really enjoy the dinners anymore, the ones where the conversation drifted aimlessly and the air felt thick with unsaid things. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in the haze of his own worries. There were things he didn't understand about his sister Ember, things that he couldn't explain but felt deep in his bones. Sometimes, when he looked at her, something cold seemed to pass between them, as if she were looking straight through him, her eyes always calculating, always empty. But Eli never spoke of it. He didn't know how to explain it to anyone, least of all his parents. He simply did what he always did, kept his head down, his mouth shut, and hoped that the days would pass without anything dramatic happening. But that night, something shifted, something clicked inside Ember, and the atmosphere in the house began to change, even if no one else noticed it. Ember sat at the far end of the table, her small frame barely visible between the tall chairs. Her eyes, large and dark, seemed to drink in the silence, absorbing the low hum of her family's indifference. She wasn't really part of the conversation. She rarely was. Instead, her attention was fixed on the movements around her, the clink of silverware, the soft murmur of voices, the way her mother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her wineglass. Ember had noticed everything, as she always did. She noticed the way her father's eyes glazed over when Carrie spoke about work, the way her mother's smile never quite reached her eyes anymore, the way Eli always withdrew further into himself, like a wounded animal hiding in a corner. Tonight, though, there was something else. A sense of heaviness settled over Ember, a quiet rage building slowly, carefully, beneath the surface of her composed expression. She had been waiting for a moment like this, a small opening, a slight crack in the perfect facade of her family's life. And it came unexpectedly, but precisely when she needed it. It started with a simple, almost trivial thing. Ember knocked over her glass of water. The spill was small, a few droplets of liquid staining the white tablecloth. It wasn't a big deal, really. She could have easily cleaned it up, but the act itself felt significant, as though it were a signal, a trigger. She looked at the water spreading across the table, her fingers still gripping the glass, her breath steady and slow. She was calm, unnervingly calm. Carrie, sitting across from her, immediately froze, her eyes narrowing in irritation. She had always been the one to insist on cleanliness, order, and perfection in the household. The slightest mess could send her into a fit of anxiety. Her voice, tight and controlled, rose above the sound of the dinner table. "Ember, be careful," she said, her tone sharper than usual. "You're always so careless." Ember didn't respond. She didn't apologize or flinch, as most children would have. Instead, she simply stared at her mother, her gaze unwavering, as if measuring her words, her reaction, her very essence. The room seemed to grow colder in that instant, the weight of the silence pressing down on the family. Carrie's eyes flickered with annoyance, but Ember didn't look away. Her mother's irritation only fed something inside her, a spark of resentment that had been building for months, for years, and tonight It was finally ready to ignite. Jason, sensing the tension, glanced up from his food, but only briefly, before turning his attention back to his phone. His mind was elsewhere, too preoccupied with work to notice the subtle shift in the air. Eli, meanwhile, continued to eat, his eyes fixed downward, as if hoping the moment would pass quickly. But Ember wasn't done. The water, the tiny accident, was only the beginning. The thing that had been building inside her, that unspoken fury, needed an outlet. It needed to be acknowledged, and if no one else would do it, she would. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her glass back on the table and, with an almost mechanical precision, wiped her hand across the spill, spreading the water further, making the mess bigger. Her mother's breath caught in her throat. Carrie's hands trembled, and the wine glass clinked unsteadily against the table. She stood up too quickly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. The noise was like a jolt of electricity, sparking the tension that had been hanging in the air, unseen, like a storm cloud gathering strength. "Ember," Carrie snapped, her voice strained. "What is wrong with you? Why can't you ever pay attention to what you're doing? You've ruined dinner. Again." The words cut through the silence, and Ember's small heart raced, but not from fear. No, it was something far more dangerous, something cold, something calculating. She looked at her mother, her gaze hardening, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something rise inside her, something that had been buried so deep it had been suffocating. But now, it was coming to the surface, and there was no turning back. Carrie's hand flew to her hip, her expression a mixture of anger and disbelief, but what she saw in Ember's eyes sent a chill through her. It was as if her daughter wasn't even there anymore, as if something else had taken her place. Ember's face remained eerily blank, her lips not even twitching with a hint of apology. She simply stared, her eyes deep, unblinking. Jason finally looked up, sensing the escalation. But it was too late. His eyes met Ember's, and the look she gave him, a look that was neither fear nor anger, but something darker, something more dangerous, made his stomach drop. He opened his mouth to say something, but words failed him. He swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. Carrie's voice rose, shrill now, her frustration building into something she couldn't control. "This is ridiculous, Ember. You never listen. You never." The words stopped abruptly. Carrie froze, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. She didn't know why, but in that moment, she suddenly realized something terrifying. The child before her, the one she had dismissed so many times, the one she had thought was just going through a phase, was not the same girl she had raised. Something had changed. Ember wasn't just a child anymore. She wasn't just angry. She was dangerous. And the terrifying truth settled in like ice in Carrie's veins. Tonight, it wasn't just the water she had spilled. It was everything. All the years of neglect, of quiet suffering, of being unseen and unheard. Everything that Ember had been holding back was now ready to break free, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. Ember had finally made her move. The game had begun. The quiet hum of the house at night was nothing but a cover for the storm that had been quietly brewing inside Ember for months. She had always been the observer, the one who stayed in the background, unnoticed by everyone around her, watching, calculating. They thought she was just another strange, introverted child, a little more withdrawn than most, but Ember was anything but ordinary. And by now, the cracks in the facade of her family were too deep, too wide to ignore. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and the pieces were finally falling into place. It wasn't the glass of water that had spilled, or the anger that had flared up over something so trivial. That had been only the spark, a flicker of chaos in an otherwise predictable routine. What mattered now was the plan. Ember had been working on it for longer than anyone realized. At first, it was just an idea, a seed planted in her mind, like a tiny, sharp thorn. But over time, the idea had grown, expanding like a cancer inside her, until it was the only thing that mattered. She would be the one to control the narrative. She would be the one to decide who lived and who died. There was no turning back. Ember knew that the key to getting what she wanted was in control. Control of herself, control of the situation, and control over everyone around her. Her parents, who had long stopped paying attention to her, never realized how carefully she had been observing them, how she had studied their routines, their weaknesses, their patterns. Carrie, her mother, was easy to predict, always consumed with appearances, always looking to keep up the image of the perfect family. She was a creature of habit, her every action dictated by a need for stability, for perfection. Jason, her father, was a different story. He was distant, lost in his own world, consumed by his work. He hadn't been a father in any real sense of the word. He hadn't been a husband either. He was a shadow in the house, a figure that drifted in and out of their lives, barely present except for when it was convenient. His detachment made him vulnerable, and Ember knew how to exploit that. Eli, her older brother, was the most difficult to read. He was quiet, introverted, more of a mirror to her own tendencies than anything else. There were moments when she wondered if he could feel the same emptiness she felt, if he too longed to tear apart the fragile threads holding their family together. But it didn't matter. He wasn't the target. He would be a casualty, an afterthought, a necessary part of the plan. In the end, he wouldn't be able to stop her. No one would. The house was the perfect setting. Large, sprawling, too big for a family of 4, with long hallways and closed-off rooms that were rarely used. It was the kind of house that bred isolation, where everyone could pretend to be together even when they were apart. Ember had studied the layout of the house, meticulously every door, every window, every possible escape route. She knew where each of them slept, where each of them felt safest. She had watched them long enough to understand their routines, their vulnerabilities, and now she would use that knowledge to her advantage. She started small at first, gathering the necessary tools, each one carefully selected for its purpose. There was a kitchen knife she had found, in the drawer, long, sharp, the perfect tool for someone who needed precision. She'd taken it out a few times, held it in her hands, felt the cold steel against her skin. She wasn't afraid of it. In fact, it made her feel powerful, in control. Next, there was the rope, which she'd scavenged from the garage, and the duct tape, a simple yet effective tool that she had seen her mother use for any number of household repairs. She had carefully hidden all of it in her room, beneath her bed, away from prying eyes. No one would suspect a thing. No one would think to look at the quiet, pale girl who spent all her time alone in her room, drawing in her sketchbook. The most important part of the plan, however, was timing. Ember had been biding her time, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity to strike. She had learned that nothing could be rushed, that chaos had to be executed with precision, with patience. It wasn't about simply attacking. It was about making sure everything unfolded just the way she wanted. The house had to be quiet, everyone had to be in the right place, and the world outside had to be just as still. She couldn't afford any distractions. It was a Wednesday night when Ember decided that the time had come. The evening had been like any other dinner. The flickering of the television in the background, Jason buried in his phone, Carrie sipping wine and scrolling through social media, Eli with his headphones on, retreating into his own little world. The family existed in a kind of suspended animation, disconnected from each other, unaware of the storm that was quietly gathering in the background. Ember had spent the last few days preparing, watching, waiting. She had made sure that everyone was predictable. Eli, as usual, treated to his room after dinner. He would be the first to go. He was the weak link. He wouldn't fight her. He never did. Carrie would follow. Ember knew her mother well enough to understand her patterns. She would go to bed early, like she always did, exhausted from a day spent trying to maintain the perfect image. Carrie was a creature of habit, a slave to routine. She would go to bed at exactly 10:30 p.m. without fail. Jason, on the other hand, would remain downstairs, working late into the night as he always did. He was predictable, too lost in his emails, too distracted to notice anything until it was too late. The house would be empty, quiet. It would be her moment, the space and time where everything she had been planning would fall into place. Ember didn't need to rush. She just needed to be patient. At 10 p.m., she slipped into the hallway. She moved soundlessly, her bare feet pressing softly against the hardwood floors. She made her way to Eli's room first. He was sitting on his bed, headphones on, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. She watched him for a moment, his obliviousness almost comical. He had no idea what was coming. She walked into his room, the door creaking slightly, just enough to alert him. He looked up, startled, but it was too late. Before he could speak, she had covered his mouth with the duct tape. He struggled briefly, but Ember was faster. She had him tied up, the rope biting into his wrists. Before he could even protest, there was no fear in her eyes. There was no hesitation. He was just a casualty, a piece in the puzzle. Next, she moved quickly, methodically, to Carrie's room. Her mother was just about to climb into bed, the covers pulled back, the soft light of the lamp casting long shadows across her face. Carrie didn't even notice Ember entering the room. She was so used to her daughter's silence, so used to ignoring the quiet girl in the corner, that she failed to see the storm approaching. But when she did notice Ember standing at the foot of her bed, the fear in her mother's eyes was immediate. The realization was slow, but it was there, sharp and unrelenting. Ember was no longer the quiet, withdrawn child she had once been. She was a force, and nothing in her eyes, nothing in her body language, would allow Carrie to see her as anything else. The plan was almost complete. Finally, there was Jason. He was downstairs, oblivious to everything that was happening upstairs. Ember had learned long ago that he was the easiest to manipulate. He had never been present in her life, never truly engaged. His detachment made him an easy target, and she knew it would take nothing more than a few minutes to finish what she had started. Everything was in place. She had been meticulous. She had waited for the right moment. And now, as the darkness of the night settled in around the house, the time had come to finish it. There was no turning back. There never had been. Ember's grip on the knife tightened. Her plan was almost complete. Soon, everything would be in her hands. The house was unnaturally quiet, the silence pressing in on Ember's ears like a suffocating weight. The faint sound of a ticking clock in the hallway echoed through the halls, marking the passage of time, a countdown that could not be stopped. She stood at the threshold of her brother's room, watching him through the dim light that filtered in from the hallway. He was just where she had left him, sitting on the edge of his bed, his headphones securely in place, his eyes fixed on the small screen of his phone. Eli was oblivious to everything. His focus was on the virtual world that consumed him, as if nothing else existed. In this moment, in the darkened quiet of the house, it was as though he were already dead. Ember's movements were silent, practiced, deliberate. Her breath was steady, her heart rate barely rising as she crossed the room. She was calm, too calm. Her hand, still holding the roll of duct tape, hovered for a moment above his mouth. He looked up from his phone just as she reached him, his eyes blinking in confusion as he registered her presence. It took him too long to react, to register what was happening, and by the time he did, it was already too late. With a swift motion, Ember pressed the tape against his lips, silencing his startled gasp. His body jerked in response, but Ember was faster. She had trained herself for moments like this, where hesitation was the enemy, where every second mattered. She moved behind him, wrapping the tape around his face to secure it tightly, suffocating his attempts to scream. His eyes widened, fear flickering in them, but Ember wasn't afraid. Fear had no place in her plan. Eli struggled against her, but Ember was small, light, and incredibly strong, in ways no one expected from a girl of her size. She had spent weeks preparing for this night, building her strength, rehearsing the moves in her mind. He couldn't overpower her. He was weak, and she had all the control. Once the tape was secure, she moved to his wrists, quickly tying them with the rope she had hidden beneath her bed. He squirmed, kicking out with his legs, but Ember was already ahead of him. She was already thinking several steps ahead. As she finished securing the knots, she shoved him back onto the bed, forcing him to lie down, the ropes biting into his skin. His body was small, still a child's, but in this moment, Eli was nothing more than a pawn in her game. She stood over him, watching him struggle, her eyes cold, calculating. She could see the panic in his face, the recognition that he wasn't going to escape this. But there was no pity in her. She felt nothing for him. He was just a casualty, part of the plan. And he wasn't the one she was really after. With one last look at Eli, Ember left the room. The clock was ticking, and there was no time to waste. She moved down the hallway, her footsteps light, echoing only faintly against the polished wood floors. Her heart did not race, but a different feeling surged in her chest, a sense of anticipation, of accomplishment, as if she were watching her life unfold exactly as she had written it. She reached Carrie's room. Her mother, as expected, was already in bed, the covers pulled up to her chin, her eyes half closed in exhaustion. Carrie's movements had slowed in recent months. She was no longer the driven, hyper-aware woman she once was. She was a shell, a woman drained by the life she had created for herself. The perfect house, the perfect family, the perfect imagination of it mattered now. Ember stood in the doorway, watching her mother's shallow breathing, the rise and fall of her chest. It was almost too easy. Everything about Carrie was predictable. The small lamp on the bedside table cast long shadows across the room, painting her mother's face in a cold, muted light. Ember felt nothing as she stepped forward, moving towards the bed with calculated precision. Carrie never even stirred, lost in her own exhausted stupor. Ember hovered above her, staring down at her mother's face, her mind clearer than ever. This was the moment when everything would be decided. She reached down, her fingers closing around the cold metal blade she had carefully hidden in her pocket. The knife was sharp, precise, just like everything else about her plan. Without hesitation, she brought it to her mother's neck, the cold steel pressing against soft skin. The first cut was swift, almost graceful, like slicing through butter. Carrie's eyes snapped open at the sudden pressure, but it was too late. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but Ember had already tightened her grip, the knife cutting deeper, more efficiently. Carrie's hands flew up, trying to push Ember away, but she had no strength left. Her struggles were weak, and Ember was too strong, too focused. The blood pulsed from the wound, soaking Carrie's pillow, staining the once pristine sheets a dark, unnatural red. It was over quickly. Her mother's body went limp, her eyes glazed over in the same dull surprise that Ember had seen in her father's expression so many times before, completely unaware, completely absent. With Carrie dead, Ember stood over her mother's body for a long moment. There was no satisfaction in this. There was only the hollow echo of a plan fulfilled. But there was no time to dwell on the death of the woman who had never really been a mother to her. She had to move on. Jason was downstairs. His office was just at the far end of the hallway, tucked away in the corner of the living room. He would be working, just as he always did, lost in his emails, his reports, his thoughts. His detachment was his greatest weakness. He would never see it coming. Ember moved quickly. She did not linger. There was no room for doubt now. She had taken control, and nothing could stop her. Downstairs, she could hear the faint click of Jason's keyboard, the soft hum of the computer monitor. He was engrossed, lost in his work, as usual. Ember stood in the shadows for a moment, watching him, feeling the calmness of the night wrapping around her like a cloak. This was the last step. This was the one that would seal everything. Jason's office door was slightly ajar, and Ember pushed it open, moving inside with the stealth of a shadow. She saw him before he saw her, his back to her as he typed away, unaware of the danger that lurked just behind him. With a suddenness that took him by complete surprise, Ember lunged. The knife was already in her hand, its weight comforting, familiar. Jason barely had time to turn before the blade was buried in his side, the shock of it registering only a second too late. He gasped, trying to cry out, but the words were lost in a strangled gasp as the blood poured from him. Ember twisted the knife, dug it in deeper. Her small hands wrapped tightly around the handle. Jason's body slumped against the desk, his face contorting in pain and disbelief. He tried to push himself up, his hands shaking as he reached for the phone on his desk, but Ember was already there, pulling him back, sinking the knife deeper. His struggles were weak, like the flailing of a dying animal, and within moments, he was still. Ember stood over him, her breath steady, her chest rising and falling in rhythmic calm. She watched him bleed out, watched as the life drained from his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she felt a strange satisfaction, a coldness that settled in her bones. There was no joy in this, no triumph, just the emptiness of it all, the certainty that everything was now in its right place. The house was silent again. Jason, Carrie, and Eli were dead. The life that had once filled these rooms, these halls, was gone. Ember's plan was complete. The perfect family had crumbled, and she was the one who had brought it all down. She didn't need to look back. There was no one left to stop her now, no one left to judge her. The world outside would never know what had happened here, in this house, in this family. Ember had played her part perfectly, and the story she had written would be the only one that mattered. The clock ticked on. The house stood eerily still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something that would never come. The bodies of her family lay scattered, lifeless, in the rooms that once echoed with their voices. Ember stood in the middle of it all, her small frame untouched by the blood that had soaked the carpets, the pillows, the walls. The air was thick with the metallic scent of death, but it didn't faze her. She had expected this, had known this would be the outcome, long before she had begun. Now, the silence was a companion she could almost cherish. There would be no interruptions, no judgment, no questions. The clock ticked on in the background, a steady reminder of the time that had passed since the final blow. Ember moved with a deliberate slowness, the precision of her actions now matched only by the cold emptiness that settled into her chest. There was no guilt here, no remorse. What remained inside her was a quiet satisfaction, a sense of something having been completed, as if she had simply done what needed to be done. She glanced at the bodies, the twisted, crumpled forms of her mother, father, and brother, and felt nothing. Not fear, not grief. Only the faintest echo of a life that no longer mattered. She moved toward the living room, eyes scanning the space as if it were a canvas she was inspecting after finishing a masterpiece. The house was her stage, and she had played her part flawlessly. The furniture was untouched, the remnants of dinner still sitting on the table, a reminder of the illusion of normalcy that had once surrounded them. It was all so easily shattered. Just a few hours ago, it had seemed like any other night. But that night was long gone now. Outside, the sun had begun to rise, casting its pale light across the horizon, indifferent to the bloodshed inside the house. Ember stared out the window, watching the world continue as it always did, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded within these walls. There was no rush. There was no need for escape. Everything was already set in motion. The aftermath would unfold as it would, but it would be too late to stop anything now. Ember's movements were almost mechanical as she began the process of cleaning up, her small hands working with unnerving efficiency. She had thought of everything: how to cover her tracks, how to make the scene look like something it was not. No one would suspect a girl like her. No one would see the monster lurking behind the carefully constructed mask of innocence. She wiped down the knives, the blood from her fingers, the handles that had been touched only by the cold steel of the blade. The rope was hidden, the tape discarded, and the remnants of her actions carefully concealed. By the time the first knock on the door came, Ember had already ensured that the scene appeared like nothing more than a tragedy, horrible accident that no one could have seen coming. The police would find it difficult to piece together the full extent of what had happened. There was no way to trace her, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Just the bodies, cold and lifeless, like rag dolls abandoned by their puppeteer. She heard the knock again, louder this time, followed by the sound of voices outside, the neighbors. Of course they had noticed the silence by now. They had seen her father leave for work that morning. They had seen her mother go to the store. But what could they know? they couldn't possibly understand. They couldn't see the way Ember had planned it all, how she had watched them all like a spider weaving her web, waiting for the right moment to strike. She walked to the door, her face an unreadable mask. When she opened it, there was no panic in her eyes, no sign of the terror that would have gripped most children. Just the cool, steady gaze of a girl who had already moved on from what had happened inside. She could hear the sirens in the distance now, drawing closer, but it didn't matter. Everything was already in motion. They would find what they would find, and in the end, Ember would still be standing. The officer looked at her, his eyes scanning her face for something he couldn't place, something he couldn't name. She gave him nothing, not a single hint of what had truly happened. She was a picture of innocence, a girl alone in a house full of death. But there was something unsettling about the way she stood there, so still, so calm. She looked like a girl caught in a nightmare, but somehow it was clear she wasn't afraid. Not at all. Behind her, the house loomed dark and silent, as if the very walls were holding their breath, waiting for the world to discover the terrible truth hidden within. But Ember knew. She already knew what would happen next. The questions would come. The investigations would unfold. But nothing could stop what she had set in motion. She had already won. The revelation came not with a sudden flash of truth, but a slow, creeping realization that settled over the investigators like a thick fog. At first, they couldn't understand why everything felt wrong. The bodies were positioned with an unsettling precision, the scene too calculated, too clean. The lack of a struggle. Eli had been tied up before the attack. Carrie had never tried to fight. None of it made sense. Ember was still the prime suspect, but something about her demeanor had left them questioning themselves. How could a child so small, so innocent-looking, commit such horrific acts without a trace of fear or remorse? The twist didn't come from the evidence at all. It came from the house itself, from the walls that seemed to whisper secrets, from the strangest clue they had missed: an old, faded drawing tucked beneath Ember's bed. It was a child's drawing, of course, but not like any other. The scene depicted a family, yes, but the faces were twisted, distorted, like something out of a nightmare. The children in the drawing were smiling wide, their mouths too large, their eyes too bright. And at the center of it all, a small figure stood alone, its body stretched unnaturally tall, its eyes dark and hollow. The more they looked at it, the more they realized the drawing wasn't just a piece of childhood art. It was a map, a blueprint. The same twisted figure in the center, it was Ember. She was always the one in control.